I'm Marshall Kozlov, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My Hudson colleague, Arthur Herman, is the author of Freedom's Forge, the book that one needs to read to understand the World War II history of the Arsenal of Democracy and what it means for the United States today. Arthur is going to make a return appearance on the show to not only update us on where the Arsenal of Democracy topic is today, but also speak to broader writings he's done about the fall of Pax Americana and what that means for U.S. foreign and defense policy moving forward. Questions of limits, ambitions, and new paradigms are at the center of our conversation.
A healthy foreign policy and defense policy. This is important, I think, to realize. It's a very simple, but I think it's an unassailable formula. A healthy foreign policy and defense policy is one that aligns means with commitments. In other words, that your means of fulfilling commitments, if necessary by force, and your level and degree of commitments are as close to alignment and in balance as possible. We're not there anymore. We're now at a point where our commitments really could possibly overwhelm us in the case of these wars becoming accelerating and growing. And this could happen so fast and so quickly in today's environment that it'll be very difficult to deal with it the way we did in World War II.
Hope you all enjoy it. Arthur Herman, welcome back to Arsenal of Democracy.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to be here.
We wrote the book on it, so we always have to have you back contractually to a certain degree. We last spoke in September. We obviously talked about the Arsenal of Democracy concept. We talked about our context with that issue in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but now we've obviously expanded the theater set to the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, Houthis in Yemen. So I'd love for you just to start by just giving your sort of state of play for where we stand geopolitically right now.
Sure. Well, I think what I've been trying to do recently is kind of raise the level of perspective. I mean, the Arsenal of Democracies piece was one in a project I've been working on for a number of years of finding ways in which the U.S. can build this global network with the other democratic allies for developing and building the weapon systems of the future and of the present too, in shipbuilding, for example. I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't realize that some of our allies are among the best shipbuilders, including Navy shipbuilders in the world. There's a lot we can do to make up for the shortfalls that we feel and that we know about in our own naval building capacity. But what I wanted to do now was to sort of raise the level of discussion, also in an historical way too, because I think that's really what think tanks should be about. You have to be careful not to get too caught up in the rage of the news cycle, especially when things are as chaotic and happening as fast as they are today. And you have to be able to sort of step back and sort of say what's really happening here and really what's the path and direction that we can really sort of point ourselves towards that can get us out of this period of confusion, disorder, and disorientation. And I think that expresses a lot of what's happening right now from terms of our foreign policy and defense policy. People sense there's something really wrong. Where we're facing not just a war in Ukraine, which is we now feel ourselves being drawn into step by step. It's one of the biggest worries people have right now. How far does the U.S. commitment to supporting Ukraine really go? Does that include not just sending military equipment and weapons, but is that at some point going to include a more tangible U.S. presence in support of this? And everything that would be involved. We have the possibility now of a conflict with China, not just over Taiwan, but the growing threat that we face and that China is bringing to bear in the South China Sea. You know, there's been a series of incidents involving the Philippines, which could easily serve as a flashpoint for a conflict, let alone what's been the tension growing over the Taiwan Straits. And you just mentioned what's been happening since, and that is what's been taking place in the Middle East. Not just the Israel and Gaza and the conflict with the U.S. and the Houthis in the Red Sea, and all the challenges that go with that, strategic, military, as well as economic. But we still have the wild card there. That's Hezbollah, and how Hezbollah's involvement in the ongoing conflict with Israel and with Hamas could also be another destabilizing factor, where again we see Iran taking the lead. So we face Iran in the Middle East as the main mover and director of action there. We see Russia resurging as a power in dealing with in the war in Ukraine, when everybody thought that Russia was on the verge of collapse. And now we've got China, which really feels like it has an advantage, not just in what's happening in Taiwan and the South China Sea, but globally. All of this has arisen because, as I have suggested in my most recent article for National Interest on this topic, is that the Pax Americana, which really created a stable world economic as well as strategic order, even through the Cold War years, that Pax Americana established in the post-World War II era is now at an end. If it's not actually dead, it's dying. And that's why we get this sense that the world's on fire, and that it seems more and more difficult to get control over what's happening and what's taking place. So the piece that I wanted to do was to take a step back and to really understand if the Pax Americana, that global order that we've been such a mainstay for, if that's really coming apart now, what lies ahead in the future? And I really point to 4 different pathways that I feel are likely for future U.S. foreign policy, economic policy, as well as defense policy, with the growing threat from Russia, China, and Iran. And also pointing to the pathway that I think will be the most beneficial and advantageous for us, most advantageous and beneficial for the free world and the other democracies. And ultimately, I think the one that will be the basis for a reconstructing a stable order in the world. Because I just don't think, Marshall, it's possible to do it without U.S. leadership. If the U.S. isn't there to lead in one form or another, then the hopes for freedom, the hopes for democracy, even the hopes for prosperity, I think, are in serious doubt.
Before we get into the specific paths, I'd love to interrogate what you mean by the Pax Americana, especially in the post-war order sense, because one could argue in many ways that the post-war order, the Pax Americana, these are interchangeable, they're the same thing. You could also argue that the post-war order relied on a Pax Americana to back it up. And then some could say that, well, maybe we favor a more multipolar world, and then ideally we could then merge that with the post-war order of its sustained peace. How should we break up and interrogate these things?
Sure. In fact, you just put your finger on one of those possible pathways, which is the idea that we want to have that it's actually more beneficial to have a multipolar as opposed to a unipolar world. But a Pax Americana wasn't contingent on it being a unipolar world. The Pax Americana held all through the Cold War, when we had a major antagonist, the Soviet Union, with whom we were dealing, even an antagonist who had a powerful ally for the early years of that Cold War, namely China, communist China. The Pax Americana is not about overarching American superiority and control of what happens in the world. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding. What most experts, foreign policy experts, when they talk about the Pax Americana, what they really mean is the ability of American military and economic power to provide a basis of stability in the world order and in the world economic picture, which was able to avoid a general war of the kind that the world had experienced first in 1914, 1918, and then again in 1939, 1945. So that even at the Cold War, even at the height of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, we had a world which was able to rely on the idea that we weren't going to face a general conflagration and all of the destruction and chaos that would flow from that. Of course, we taught that we have the threat. There's always the threat of nuclear holocaust, the threat of nuclear war. But one of the key aspects of the Pax Americana was the fact that we found a way in which to stabilize the arms race, the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, and found a way in which it was possible to maintain that stable order throughout the world here. Doesn't mean there weren't wars. Korea, Vietnam, the Russia, and Soviet Union, and China fighting war against each other. Wars broke out. What took place, including wars that we were participant in. But there was always the sense that ultimately American military power and American and economic power provided this sort of stable foundation on which other countries could rely, even our antagonists.
What changed then?
Well, what changed were both of those factors underwent enormous transformation. Number one, the idea that that the U.S. military would be strong enough to be able to deal with any kind of threat anywhere in the world and challenge to its allies, that has waned significantly. And what we've seen is, even though our defense budget has increased, what's the latest request now is $880 billion, almost $1 trillion defense budget. And yet, in terms of military readiness, we're probably at one of the low points that we've seen in the entire post-war world. So the idea that American military would be there to deal with any kind of threat, any kind of commitment to allies and so on, that's faded a lot. And allies understand that and recognize that fact. That's number one. The second one is that throughout the entire Pax Americana period after World War II, there was this sense, which was very real for several decades, that America was the great economic powerhouse of the world, that we had the most powerful, the most vibrant, the most innovative economy, and that economy is one which could sustain not only prosperity for Americans and a world trade system that benefited the other great industrialized nations as well, but that it was also strong enough and powerful enough to sustain a military of the size and capability that was needed to meet all of those global commitments that were sitting out there. So it's important to realize that when we talk about American economy in the 1950s, in the 1960s, into the 1970s, we were talking about an economy of which our defense industrial base was an important part. Mm-hmm. Though the companies that made up our defense industrial base, the number of workers who are involved in it was a sizable chunk of our GDP. Not as large as it was, let's say, in the Soviet Union, for example, but still, and not, we wouldn't call it a prime driver of the U.S. economy. But my goodness, those companies that were producing the equipment, the ships, the planes, the tanks, everything that was needed to sustain a military of that size, those companies and that sector of the economy was a very strong and vibrant one. Not so anymore. It's been totally eclipsed by Silicon Valley, by high tech, by a range of other new industries that have sprung up. In many cases, because of the work and innovation that was inspired by our defense industrial base and our defense needs. That was the other thing. A strong defense economy was also a driver of our civilian economy because of the innovation, the new inventions, the new transformations, the computer, the internet. All of these sprang up originally from our defense needs and from a Pax Americana's requirements for a strong, vibrant military and strong, vibrant economy. Both of those factors have now faded. Our military is by no means, while it's still the largest in the world, I think everybody recognizes now that it is overstretched and can't meet all the commitments that it faces at a current time. Our economy, and also our economy, of course, is now being increasingly overshadowed by the growth of China and eventually the growth of India as well.
I want to just diagnose the problem from your perspective then. Is the problem that when you're referring to U.S. military readiness, is that speaking to, once again, the point about how we would have to conceivably fight in multiple theaters in ways that we can't keep up with? Is that on a per unit basis? Like, how should we understand that problem?
I think in the former more than in the latter. Mm-hmm. That, in other words, we face a situation we may have, as you just said, multiple conflicts taking place at once. Even at the height of American military power, engaging in a multi-theater conflicts with near-peer rivals is a pretty scary proposition. I mean, it was one that really had to be worked out very, very carefully. Today, if we face simultaneous conflicts that accelerate in, let's say, Ukraine, in the Taiwan Straits, as well as in the Middle East, it's going to be very, very difficult to see how our military is going to be able to contend with all three, or two, or even possibly in the case of China, one. It's one of the biggest concerns that every strategic thinker, including those in the Pentagon as well as outside, is facing and dealing with. How do we confront this problem? And that is, look, a healthy foreign policy and defense policy. This is important, I think, to realize. It's a very simple, but I think it's an unassailable formula. A healthy foreign policy and defense policy is one that aligns means with commitments. Mm-hmm. In other words, that your means of fulfilling commitments, if necessary by force, and your level and degree of commitments are as close to alignment and in balance as possible. We're not there anymore. We're now at a point where our commitments really could possibly overwhelm us in the case of these wars becoming accelerating and growing, and this could happen so fast and so quickly in today's environment that it'll be very difficult to deal with it the way we did in World War II. In World War II, we faced a two-front war. We couldn't fight simultaneously with the same strength on two. The decision was made by Roosevelt and his advisors, and by the Joint Chiefs, that we would fight the war in Europe against Nazi Germany first, and hold our ground in the Pacific against Japan until we had the upper hand and had the resources by which to fight both at the same time. But even at the height of the Pacific War, the amount of equipment and the commitment of troops and resources in Europe was far greater than what was happening in the Pacific. And we also had the advantage, we come back to my point about economic power, we also had the biggest and most powerful industrial economy at the disposal of our military as well. So that even though we faced overwhelming commitments in 1941, 1942, right after Pearl Harbor, by 1943, 1944, that industrial production, that productivity had raised the means by which we could really fight a two-front war. That's what that book that I wrote, Freedom's Forge, is all about. And I think, Marshall, that's one of the reasons why that book has become more and more fascinating to strategic thinkers, to people inside and outside the Pentagon, defense community, and Congress. I think one of the reasons is people are seeing that in 1941 we faced a situation not so different from what we face now, in which our commitments worldwide far outstripped our ability to meet them. And we had enemies, Japan in the first place, Nazi Germany in the second, who grasped that, who understood and thought they could take advantage of this in order to win, not just against us, but also defeat our allies at the same time. It was a miscalculation on their part. What we have to do now, and one of the reasons why I wrote this piece on the new Pax Americana, what we need to do is to make sure that they don't make that mistake again.
What I'm fascinated by, because let's stick with your means and capabilities rubric, is the critical mistake that not only the Japanese and Germans made when it came to 39, 40, 41, but also pessimist, defeatist, isolationist at home made, was misinterpreting the difference between means and capabilities. So maybe the United States of 1939 didn't seem like it was in a great place, but the point was what could America in 1944 do? What would you say today is the gap between our means and our actual potential and capability when we think about it in that framework?
Well, here I'm going to say—
if we got serious over 5 years, what could we do?
Right. Over the course of 5 years? Well, again, I think what it is you have to be able to choose the policy course. And that's why in the article I mentioned 4 different ways in which to go. Very quickly. One is you simply say, look, the United States is just not going to be in a position anytime soon to provide the kind of leadership around the world that we used to be able to provide. That maybe it's time to pass the baton to China, for example, and to recognize that we live in a post-American world, to use the phrase that Fareed Zakaria wrote a best-selling book and coined that phrase, to describe a world in which the United States is one of many powers, not as opposed to really sort of the leading power, the one that really determines the shape and direction of the global order. The multipolar world that you mentioned earlier, that's the outlook that we have to look forward to here. And what I suggested in the article is I think that although that seems to give us a chance to sort of relax and not feel like we really have to make a big effort now, just let the world happen the way it's going to happen. But I also suggested I think that's actually going to be very bad news for us over time, because I don't think China is going to allow us to it's not going to allow us to be simply limited to our sphere of influence. They see their global ambitions in a much larger and much more dangerous way directed towards us.
A quick note that I think is important is that, the post-American world, the first version, came out in 2008, 2009. So I think whether or not one agreed with the framework then, the world looked very different. I think it was easy
Even he recognizes that now.
Yeah, and of course, this is just, I think it's very important, I think, to think through these concepts through the lens of like, when would you say, if it's 2008, it's easy to imagine, look, we got off track because of the war in Iraq and our response to the war on terror. We do see a rising, think of how much more optimistic the European picture looked. So it's
and
very
think about
interesting.
when the original book originally came out, what the picture of China was, which was shared by across the board. The consensus is as China becomes richer and more prosperous, it will become more like us. That there will be a gradual lessening of any degree of tension that will find the U.S. and China working together and cooperating in a range of issues, including those who still insist that there's a room for us to cooperate on climate change, for example. So this is not to say that Fareed Zakaria in the post-American world, that he would, if he wrote that book now, that he would write it in quite the same way. He has a new book out which suggests that's not the case at all. But at the same time, I think it captured a benign view of a multipolar world, which we're learning just doesn't really hold up very well. The real question is, if you have this vision, what kinds of policies do you follow? And I think what we've seen with the current administration is one that's still very much shaped by that hopeful picture that if the U.S. simply, finds a way to think about China not as an antagonist but just as a competitor, that in fact all will be well for us, and that we don't have to, that there'll be ways to lessen international tensions, particularly tensions with China. What we've found out is that's not the case. China will take advantage of that.
Fascinating. So let me put on my Biden spokesman hat and say, what is the tangible difference between competitor and adversary? Like, for example, in U.S.-China tech policy, I don't think that the Chinese would argue that we have a benign approach to the Chinese tech industry, especially in critical sectors. But to your point, they would then say that qualifies as competition. So help us to sort of understand the difference in implementation.
Sure. I don't want to get too bogged down in semantic differences, but a competitor, let's say take it in the sports sense or in the business sense, right? We think of IBM and Apple as competitors, right? Each competing for market share, each looking to leap ahead in terms of the next innovation in computer and in IT and other in AI and all the other aspects of it, or competing teams in the World Series. That's one notion of competitor. But I think that when we think about an adversary, you think about someone who doesn't want to just simply do better than you do, but wants to destroy you. and destroy the basis on which you could ever have the will to compete with them at any level again. And I think that's kind of where we are with China. And as we see more and more signs that China, in terms of seeing American weakness, sees an opportunity to not only increase its power, but also to take advantage of our weakness in that range of overcommitments. I think what we see here is a competitor much closer to the way the Soviet Union was a competitor during the Cold War than one in which the U.S. and Japan were competitors in the 1970s and 1980s in the semiconductor industry, or in racing to achieve economic primacy. Who's going to have the bigger economy? Japan and China is not Japan. China has a much bigger and much deeper vision of which take place. Now, the second path, what I mentioned is, and here we come to the question of what to do about it, is what I call the Cold War 2.0 approach, which is, China is a very serious threat. And what we need to do now is to really step up our preparedness, our readiness, and to recommit to the way in which the U.S. will be able to project power and will be able to defend its allies, both in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East, wherever the threat is coming from. We've got to be ready to deal with it and face it. Those plans, as I suggest in the article, I think are also unrealistic in terms of what the American taxpayer is willing to pay in terms of increased defense spending. And also, does it really get to the heart of what the competition, come back to our word, and the rivalry with China is really all about? I don't think it does. I think it's a way to sort of, I think it's an attempt to project the old Pax Americana into the new direction. And circumstances have changed, particularly our economic power is not what it was. Then the third one I call the Fortress America approach, which is forget about the commitments, just shed them. Get out of NATO, forget about Taiwan. If China wants Taiwan, there's really not much we can do about it. Don't worry about China's inroads and the growth of its neo-colonialist ventures in the global South and so on. Let's stay fixed on making America as strong as possible at home, defend our position here in the Western Hemisphere, protect ourselves, insulate ourselves from the chaos that's taking place in the world outside, and really focus on rebuilding and restructuring our economy and our society here in the U.S. Again, I think that's going to backfire. It's not possible to cut yourself from the world that way. And as we saw with the isolationist movement in the 1930s, it's more a formula for future disaster than it is a formula for future security. The fourth one, which is the one that my favorite, right? Just happens to be the one that I like, is the one that turns the issue of what was a liability, namely our far-flung commitments, into an asset. And that is by looking to our democratic allies, the high-tech industrial democracies, as a way in which to build a future arsenal of democracy. So we come back to our previous discussion. But there's also another component, which I also talk about in the article, of a component for the new Pax Americana, and that is of rebuilding and reshoring our economy here in the United States. That of those two factors, which have been in decline and that have weakened and I think ultimately spell the end of the old Pax Americana, our military strength on the one hand, but also our economic strength. We have to look for new ways in which to rebuild that. After decades of offshoring our manufacturing capabilities, offshoring our supply chains, it's time to start bringing that back into our control, bringing it back into an important part of our economy. But the way to do this, I think, is not simply by by rebuilding the old factories and rebuilding the old Rust Belt. It's through the advanced technologies, the very ones that'll give us the advanced weapon systems that allow us to defend ourselves and our allies in the 21st century, the ones that are foundational for the arsenal of democracies are also will be foundational for a new, vibrant, innovative economy here in the U.S. Artificial intelligence, quantum technology, additive manufacturing, and robotics, and space, the developments in space, commercial space industry. All of these represent important ways to reorient our economy and to build a strong, vibrant manufacturing as well as innovative economy. And that's really the key to what American security is all about. The other factor, again, which we could talk about at length as well as an important part of it, is energy. Mm-hmm. And the way in which we have really failed to leverage our advantage as major oil and natural gas producers on the world stage to turn that into both a strategic advantage, but also as key to our economic advantage in rebuilding our economy as well. It's really uncharted territory, believe it or not, because we tend to think about the energy sector as about energy, but it's really about manufacturing. It's really about innovation and technology. And if you think about it with that lens, you begin to see just how important and how critical developing and expanding that energy sector can really be. And that includes the green energy area too. Not ruling that out at all. Not ruling it out, because there's where innovation, research and development, and the devotion of resources will be hugely important. But you got to allow time for that transition here. Got to allow time for us. And in the meantime, to use our advantage in oil and natural gas as a way in which to help to rebuild the economy as a whole. That, I think, is the kind of grand strategic thinking that we need to start doing now as we think about what a new Pax Americana is really going to look like.
Here's what I'm curious, given that final rubric, to what degree is the tech-driven manufacturing vision you're discussing nothing's inevitable, but going to happen in the same way that from the 20s onwards, Ford, GM, all the various failed auto companies we don't remember from the period, their manufacturing process advanced without the New Deal saying they needed to have it be done. That happened. To what degree can AI, quantum computing, all these different categories, are they going to happen, or do they require turning the levers of policy and incentivization?
I think the latter. I think you do have to have a policy that's clear-sighted about this and about the role that government can play. And what I see, because I spent a lot of time looking at artificial intelligence and have over the last year and a half, and have watched with some misgiving the way in which Washington has handled the issue of AI as an emerging technology. The danger is that government will see itself as having to protect its citizens, having to protect the social and economic fabric from this new technology, and to act as a buffer through regulation, through establishing independent commissions, through a whole range of other bureaucratic tools to allow what will seem to be inevitable, to delay the inevitable, so that we have a smooth transition to that breakthrough here. Just imagine, for example, what would have happened. Because in the 1920s, when Henry Ford was pulling off his Model T miracle and the other automobile companies were rising to the challenge, government was a much smaller operation in those days, especially Washington. But just imagine after the first serious automobile crashes, let's say, right, between a Model T and a Chevrolet, right? If suddenly the legislators had said, oh my God, this is a really dangerous technology, people could get killed out there. And they had established a national automobile safety board in order to oversee the way in which cars could be produced, to set rules and regulations and standards about the production of these, about of seeing this as being a dangerous technology that needed to be regulated and needed to be controlled, and that international agreements would be necessary so that other countries which were beginning to develop an automobile industry could meet the same standards of safety, of health, of worker compensation and so on, what would have happened? Think about what the automobile revolution, how it would have been slowed to a walk under those circumstances. And you know who understands this with regard to AI? It's China. They understand the power of AI for transforming an economy. That's exactly what they're doing. Well, we worry about AI and whether it's going to let college students, cheat on their term papers. They're using AI to transform their factories and their shipyards and their industrial facilities. And they're learning how to take, and have been applying, how to use AI and robotics, bring those together, and you can speed up and accelerate industrial processes to an extraordinary rate, including your defense industrial base. Mm-hmm. They're not put off by this challenge at all. And what we need to do when it comes to these new technologies is to take a much more confident, a cautious, but cautiously optimistic approach to how we deploy and how we put these technologies to work as mainstream parts of our economy.
I think what's fascinating about a level deeper on the automobile versus AI metaphor is that I'm sure listeners are thinking, well, I mean, you probably could have had seatbelt laws earlier than you had seatbelt laws. You probably could have had speed limits earlier than you did. But what's interesting here is, what's the AI equivalent of a seatbelt law? What is the AI equivalent of a speed limit? It's very difficult to actually ascertain what that actually looks like during the actual moment. Because if we could, this is why I liked your point about how would a more aggressive, let's say 1921 version have looked. Is it a simple, we have a bit of a freedom versus order debate about safety laws with seatbelts, or is it have an inspector in every single factory looking at the alloys? And it's just because in the moment, it's virtually impossible, it seems, to actually make that differentiation that you can make 80 years later when it comes to the 30s and automobiles. Or
it's a great example. Take the example of, let's say, regulators who decide that we need to set not just speed limits for the roads, but speed limits within the car engines themselves. Mm-hmm. That we create car engines that will not go faster than 35 miles an hour.
Yep.
Because statistics shows that's the rate at which accidents that happen will have the lowest lethality rate. Imagine a government bureaucration that would take that approach,
which is more obvious, by the way.
This is what we've got now. Exactly. But my point is not to get too bogged down in the question of policy of regulation versus letting technology go where it needs to go. I think it's also to locate it in, again, the issue about what are the strategic advantages of seeing new technologies as hopeful for development, not just in terms of where your economy is going, but also the way in which they can enhance your security and enhance your ability to defend yourself and your allies against your enemies. And I think AI is still an underrated technology from that point of view. I also think that's going to be true for quantum. And I think we also need to really think about it seriously when we think about where we're going in space.
I think we can go a million different places, but we will have to bookmark the space conversation for the third version of this Arthur Herman on the Arsenal of Democracy podcast appearance. Thank you so much for joining. We've referenced a bunch of different pieces. Those will be linked in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Always a pleasure to be here. Happy to exchange ideas.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.